Welcome to the Australian Catholic Historical Society's talk on the 18th century low point of the Catholic Church. I'm James Franklin, editor of the Journal of the Australian Catholic Historical Society. Some complain that the Church has been declining in recent times. Maybe it has in some ways, but it was much worse some centuries in the past. The 18th century was not the worst of times, but it was a very bad time compared to now. Maybe we can learn something from it, and also from what happened next. I'll talk about these topics: demography and geopolitics, a survey of the big picture. Then 3 disasters the Church faced in the 18th century: in China, the Jesuits, and the French Revolution. Then 3 errors of principle they made about Inquisition, about Church and State, and about slavery. Then the responses they had to Enlightenment. On a more positive note, those who got the Church through the bad times, and then what happened later, the Catholic revival after 1815. First, let's see what you know about the Church in the 18th century. Can you name a Pope of the 18th century? Can you name a saint of the 18th century? Can you name a Catholic church built in the 18th century? Okay, here's an easier one. Can you name a priest of the 18th century? Most people have heard of Antonio Vivaldi, composer of works like Your Call is Important to Us. It's hard to say why, but Vivaldi is a top choice for the music to play when your call is put on hold. Do you know anything at all about the Church in the 18th century? There's a reason why it's fallen down a memory hole. It was a disaster from start to finish, especially finish. In 1799, Pope Pius VI died in the captivity of the French revolutionaries, who had suppressed the Church, killed hundreds of priests, and confiscated its properties. The next papal conclave almost did not take place, but with difficulty, a sufficient number of cardinals gathered in Venice, Rome being then in chaos after the French puppet republic. A compromise candidate was eventually elected as Pius VII and crowned with a papier-mâché tiara in the absence of the real one. This is Pius VII in later and happier times. That is very different from the papal funeral and conclave of 2025. That near disaster came at the end of a century filled with little but trouble and decline for the Church. Individual major setbacks, such as the end of the mission in China and the suppression of the Jesuits, were set in a context of geographic confinement, poor leadership, and failures of reform attempts, and loss of intellectual and spiritual initiative to advocates of the Enlightenment. Unexpectedly, the darkness was followed by a new dawn. By 1815, revolutionary rule was over. The Congress of Vienna re-established a pro-religious monarchist political order in Europe, which lasted for 100 years. An extraordinary revival of Catholic faith was by then underway, especially in France and Ireland, spearheaded by new religious orders active in the world of charity and education. Missionary activity would soon seed most of the world with active and growing Catholic communities, even Australia. First, the big picture of demography and geopolitics. Almost all Catholics lived in European Catholic countries and Latin America, and all those countries, except France and Austria, were economic and cultural backwaters. The grand days of the Iberian empires and of Renaissance and Baroque Italy were behind them. The initiative had passed to Britain and France, and the geopolitical struggle of the two was the defining dynamic of the century, militarily and culturally. At the death of Louis XIV in 1715, it still seemed that France might dominate the century, which would have carried Catholicism widely. That was not to be. A series of wars in many continents ended with complete British victory at Waterloo in 1815. Since the British won the struggle and so dominated the next century, the position of Catholics in English-speaking countries was important. The news was not good. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the Protestant settlement meant that penal laws applied to the few Catholics in England, perhaps only 1% of the English population was Catholic, and the many in Ireland. The failed Jacobite rebellions of 1715 and 1745 further reinforced British perceptions of Catholicism as a foreign threat. But things did improve with the Papists' Act of 1778 and the Roman Catholic Relief Act of 1793. The situation was much the same in the American colonies, where by the time of independence, probably less than 2% of the colonial population was Catholic. Anti-Catholicism was a factor in the revolution, though French military assistance was a help. In Northern Europe, Catholic missionary activity was nearly impossible in Protestant countries in Russia, while the traditionally Catholic areas of Poland and Lithuania were affected by the disturbances leading up to the final partition of Poland in 1795. Missions in Africa had got nowhere. Latin America was Catholic, but something of a backwater. However, the two now best remembered developments in 18th century Catholicism are from that region. The 1986 movie The Mission is set in the collapse of the Jesuit reductions in Paraguay in the 1750s, while Junipero Serra's mission in California proved a long-term success, distributing holy names to what will become some of the best-known cities on earth. You've heard of Los Angeles, San Francisco, Sacramento, and so on. In Asia, the disaster in China, which I'll discuss later, was accompanied by few bright spots elsewhere. The last Western missionary in Japan died in prison in 1714, and the few hidden Catholics in Japan continued to be subject to extreme persecution. The colonisation of Australia in 1788 was British. When the first fleet arrived in Botany Bay a matter of days ahead of the French, and the few Catholics among the first colonists had no priest until 1800. Samuel Hugh Moffat, in his History of Christianity in Asia, summarises the situation in the Eastern Hemisphere. The closing decades of the 18th century were sombre years for Catholic missions in Asia. Japan was still enveloped in the anguished silence that followed the Great Persecution. In China, the missions were closed by an imperious, suspicious Qing dynasty which regretted it had ever favoured them. The Dutch and English were sweeping Spanish and Portuguese shipping, the lifeline of the Catholic missions, out of the South Pacific Seas and Indian Ocean. It is true, and important as a matter of context, that Catholicism's competitors, such as Islam and Protestantism, were not very dynamic either, with the exception of the Enlightenment in its various forms. More on that later. Now the three major disasters. The Church suffered three spectacular disasters in the 18th century: the end of the China mission, the suppression of the Jesuits, and the French Revolution. There were no positive events of similar scope to compensate for them. The Jesuits had made good progress in China through the 17th century, and by 1700 the Church was more free in China than in England or Ireland. But the Jesuits' accommodation to Chinese practices, for example by regarding Chinese rites honouring ancestors as civil rather than religious practices, was opposed by the stricter Dominicans. A papal determination for the Dominican position angered the emperor, who banned Catholicism in 1721, ending the China mission. Normal operations were unable to resume for 2 centuries. The census of Jesuits in 1749 counted over 22,000 of them, and some 850 educational establishments of the order formed the core of Catholic education. The suppression of the Jesuits in 1773, forced on an unwilling Pope Clement XIV by a coalition of Catholic monarchs, was part of a struggle between papal and royal visions of the Church. The decades-long struggle in all major Catholic countries and the loss of the international Jesuit order itself left the Church much weaker in the face of developing threats. The suppression and the confiscation of Jesuit properties caused great disruption to the economy and education system, as well as to spiritual provision in Latin America and elsewhere. The end of the Jesuits was paralleled by an even larger event, the near collapse of monastic orders and enclosed orders of nuns. There were at least 15,000 monasteries for men and 10,000 for women, with 200,000 monks and at least 150,000 nuns in Catholic Europe in 1750. They had been central to Catholic life as well as to the European economy and charitable system since the early Middle Ages, and remained so into the mid-18th century. By 1800, they were almost all gone and the inmates expelled. In Austria and the Iberian domains before the Revolution, elsewhere afterwards. The French Revolution was the worst disaster of all. Religious nationalisation of church property during the Terror was among the first were closed. The 1789 reforms, priests and religious were executed. The revolution was, as one historian says, a state-sponsored assault on Christianity itself, unlike anything in the European experience since the early Roman Empire. The counter-revolution in the Vendée, which was partly a Catholic reaction, cost some 250,000 dead. From 1795, an accommodation was reached with the Concordat of 1801 permitting a church under strict state control, but without any restoration of its property. Next, 3 errors of principle. Matching those 3 acute disasters were 3 chronic disasters of theory. They are errors in a strict and uncontroversial sense. Doctrinal positions, which the Church staunchly defended into the 19th century, but which it has since admitted were wrong. They are, first, the defence of the right of the Inquisition to impose orthodoxy by force. Second, the integralist doctrine that church and state should be intertwined. And third, the view that there could be natural titles to slavery. These were not just matters of theory. They translated into repression by the real Inquisition, national churches operating as virtually a department of state, and churchmen's owning and trading in slaves. According to the Church's present-day understanding of these questions, there is a lot of truth in Enlightenment and Protestant accusations that the Catholic Church was reactionary, obscurantist, and a danger to freedom. Catholic obstinacy in those positions left it ill-prepared to combat Enlightenment challenges. The first one, the Inquisition was not abolished until the 19th century, and in the 18th, though a shadow of its former self, it remained active in many regions controlled by Catholic powers, even remote ones like New Mexico, Louisiana, and Malta. Trials were typically of ordinary people for relatively minor matters of magic, blasphemy, and heretical propositions, and death sentences were rare in most countries. In Portugal, however, auto de fe were conducted after 1761, and English suspicion of Catholic ambitions could feed on direct information from Jewish refugees from the Portuguese Inquisition. Their voices were added to the hundreds of thousands of Huguenot refugees who had fled France for England and other Protestant nations soon before 1700. The direction of refugee flows is always a solid indicator of people's wishes. The possibility of reform, but very slow reform, is shown not only by the eventual abolition of the Inquisition, but by the parallel fate of the 1633 condemnation of Galileo. It was soon quietly accepted by educated people in Catholic as well as non-Catholic countries that Copernicus and Galileo were right about heliocentrism, and Galileo's body was provided with an elaborate funerary monument in the church of Santa Croce in Florence in 1737, I suppose by way of saying no hard feelings. But Galileo's dialogue was not removed from the Index of Forbidden Books until 1757, and Galileo's works were allowed to be printed in Rome only in 1822. Jesuit internal censorship demanded that members of the order adhere to geocentrism and that any references to the Copernican system describe it merely as a hypothesis with some degree of probability. That sort of doublethink did not help Catholics to become intellectual leaders or to impress outside thinkers. The second era of theory was about church and state. You might say that the 18th was the last Constantinian century. The model of national churches controlled by kings was at a peak in the ages of absolutism and divine right of kings. It would be anachronistic to see the conflict as between church and state as if the state were a separate secular entity in competition with the church. It was instead a conflict between two theoretical models of the institutional church. We are now most used to the ultramontanist model of the church, where the Pope and Curia are in control of doctrine, policy, and appointments. The word ultramontanist is from a French perspective, meaning on the other side of the Alps. But in the 18th century, the main model was still the Gallican or Regalist view of national churches defending their liberties against the Pope. We know it best in other contexts, such as Henry VIII and the Russian Orthodox Church. An anointed king or Holy Roman Emperor regarded his or her rule over both church and state as directly ordained by God and not directly constrained by papal policy. The Regalist model had inherent advantages of power in that the monarch controlled the army, police, taxation and censorship, so could have the last word within the realm in case of conflict. The result was that in France, Spain and its empire, Portugal, the Italian states and Austria, the church was effectively a department of state, with bishops mostly appointed by the king or emperor. The suppression of the Jesuits and confiscation of their estates was a complete victory for kings over Pope. The immense energies consumed by those internal church conflicts inevitably meant less available for other activities, more useful activities such as mission, reform, charity and parish work. The third era of theory, from later perspectives and not just 21st century ones, the transatlantic slave trade was the most urgent moral issue of the 18th century. The trade reached its height in that century with over 6 million transported, yet it was almost ignored by both Christian and Enlightenment moral thinkers until towards the end of the century, English Quakers and evangelicals took up the abolitionist cause. Catholic responses were impeded by the weight of biblical and Roman law tradition that slavery was not always and in principle wrong. However, moral theology imposed many limitations both on who could become a slave and how they could be treated. Those conditions appear to rule out the African slave trade, but that connection was never made in the 18th century. The Catholic position was that in natural law there could be natural titles to slavery, which included capture in war and debt slavery. That could not cover the capture and enslavement of free persons as in Africa. Benedict XIV's 1741 bull, Immensa Pastorum, condemned for that very reason the enslavement of native peoples in Brazil, but it conspicuously failed to mention either the existing black African slaves in Brazil or the capture of slaves in Africa. Explicit change in the Church's position only began in 1814, when Lord Castlereagh requested Pius VII to support British efforts to suppress the slave trade, and the Pope wrote in strong terms to the French king. The three errors of theory were partly caused by external factors such as the power of monarchs, but were also attributable to the actions or rather inactions of Catholic theorists, especially an unwillingness to confront tradition by digging deeper into Christian principles. Relevant to today, you be the judge. Next, responses to Enlightenment. In the history of ideas, the 18th century is best known as the era of Enlightenment. What Enlightenment means is very tricky. An anti-religious view of it sees Enlightenment as a freeing of humanity from the evils of priestcraft and superstition, leading to secular modernity with its technological benefits and liberal polities. While a conservative religious view represents the Enlightenment as the source of the breakdown of traditional values and a source of horrors from guillotine to gulag. Both views have some foundation in the facts and also in the polemics of the 18th century itself, but taken together they exaggerate the conflict between religion and enlightenment. Nevertheless, the Catholic Church did have an enlightenment problem, and its response to it was less than successful. The century certainly experienced some very broad trends that are reasonably called enlightened in an uncontroversially positive sense. Religious wars of the fierceness of the 30 Years' War were no longer seen, pogroms were rare, witch trials ended, compulsory education began in some countries, the promises of science to improve lives began to be realised, with the steam engine and the first successful campaign against an infectious disease, smallpox. The intellectual advances of the leading figures, such as Newton, Leibniz, Adam Smith, Kant and Edmund Burke, were not posed as anti-Catholic, but were not a natural fit with dogmatic religion either, and they risked making Catholicism seem irrelevant to advances in thought. Those developments owed little to religious input, though they did not provoke religious opposition either. In a narrower meeting of enlightenment, it covers a range of views that really were anti-Catholic. Some prominent thinkers were militantly against dogmatic religion, such as the encyclopedists and Voltaire in France, and British thinkers like Hume and Gibbon. Thinkers with anti-Enlightenment commitments easily saw Catholicism in terms of dogmatism, superstition and reaction, while the Church suspected that undue trust in unaided reason would undermine faith. Catholic reaction to the Enlightenment could have been to encourage an attempt to co-opt and put its own stamp on it. A Christian version of Enlightenment was entirely possible. Two of the leading thinkers, Leibniz and Kant, were Lutheran at least approximately, while the model of a genius who had brought light when nature and nature's laws lay hid in night was the extremely religious Newton. A few of the leading scientists of the century were Catholic, such as Boskovic, Galvani and Lavoisier. A welcome to advances of reason was in line with the long Catholic tradition of compatibility of faith and reason. There was, to an extent, a Catholic Enlightenment, which has been much studied lately, but it didn't make a big impression. Pope Benedict XIV was in some respects a representative of Enlightenment with his allowing of Galileo, condemnation of slavery, and appointing women as professors, but his caution, such as his unwillingness to confront the issue of castrati, was as pronounced as his reformism. The result was that the Church saw a loss of intellectual and cultural initiative, epitomised by the decision not to revise the condemnation of Galileo. That's the story of the bad news about the Church in the 18th century. Now for something more edifying. Those who got the Church through. Because of the generally downward trend of the Church in the 18th century, it's especially interesting to look at those who swam against the current and ensured the survival of faith through those dark times. Again, we might learn something. In any era, the main people responsible for the transfer of piety across generations are the mostly anonymous parents whose faith is taken up by their children. You don't see much of the interior life of those transmitters of faith in the historical record, but some of their devotion can be seen in the strength of resistance to the French Revolution. The height of the de-Christianization campaign in France, symbolised by the turning over of the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris to the cult of reason, lasted only a short time, mainly 1793 to 4. Rural piety and the hiding of fugitive priests are the backgrounds to the childhood stories of the French saints of the early 19th century, such as Marcel Champagnat, Jean Vianney, the Curé of Ars, and Jean-Claude Collin, founder of the Maris brothers. That resistance was in part the effect of the large proportion of ordinary laity who had been regularly practicing the faith, such as by performing the Easter duty of Mass and Confession. In an era with few outstanding defenders of the Church, one saint did devise a workable answer to the regalism, de-Christianization and infighting of the century, though it took some time to be widely adopted. St. Alphonsus Liguori founded one of the few successful religious orders of the century, the Redemptorists, as popular preachers with easily understood sermons and a piety with highly emotional content, such as devotion to the Sacred Heart and the Stations of the Cross. Pope Leo XIII, who benefited considerably from the spread of Liguori's model in the 19th century, wrote that with the greatest skill he adapted the truths of Catholic faith to the capacity of all. He raised a bulwark for divine revelation against deists and maintained most convincingly the Immaculate Conception, strenuously contended for the primacy and infallible teaching authority of the Roman Pontiff. Liguori created a very appealing product. In place of Jansenist rigorism and Enlightenment ideas, he proposed a moral theology of divine mercy, accessed through devotion to the Eucharist and popular practices such as the Rosary. That style of devotion among the poor fueled the revival of the next century. Most older Catholics of today had a fair dose of it as children. The other now best known saint of the century, Junipero Serra, began as a popular mission preacher in Mallorca in the style of the Redemptorists. In California, his exceptional organizational abilities allowed him to establish a string of missions, such as San Diego pictured here, that made the Catholic faith central to the later history of that region, and whose success contrasted with the failed mission attempts in most other parts of the world. His success did come with some problems. As often with the first serious contact between First Nations and European empires, the death toll from introduced diseases was very high. Serra's background as an inquisitor led to a tolerance of coercion, especially of the relapse, that is, those who attempted to escape the mission. Nevertheless, his work produced in California a culture much more settled than the Wild West that was soon to develop to its east. Given the historical importance of the Anglophone world for the future, and given the extreme weakness of the church there in 1700, a special place in the history of the church's survival is occupied by those English-speaking church leaders who calmed fears, preached restraint to their flock, and dealt successfully with the authorities. As a result, the practice of the faith was much more possible in Britain and North America in 1800 than in 1700, aided by the greater toleration shown by their Protestant counterparts. Examples are Bishop Richard Challoner, a former professor of philosophy at Douai, who guided the church in London for decades, and John Thomas Troy, who was Archbishop of Dublin in the 1790s, negotiated an anti-revolutionary front with the British authorities so successfully that the British agreed to pay for the church's seminary. On a smaller scale, the well-educated Irish priest Father James Dixon enjoyed cordial relations with the Governor of New South Wales and was permitted to minister to Irish convicts in 1803, setting the scene for the toleration of Catholicism in Australia. Nan O'Nagle founded the Presentation Sisters in Cork in 1776, an active order to provide education for the poor. She negotiated both laws against Catholic education and ecclesiastical suspicion of non-enclosed orders. It proved a model for the next century. More later on that. The recovery of the institutional church from its low point of 1799 to the restoration of 1815 owed much to the political skill of Pius VII and his talented Secretary of State Ercole Consalvi. They survived the occupation of most of Europe, including Rome, by a murderous dictator Napoleon, for 3 times as long as Pius XII did under Hitler. They pioneered the very difficult policy of Concordat, which required collaboration with evil in return for minor concessions, but permitted the church to emerge not only alive, but with sufficiently clean hands to deal credibly with the successor regime. Finally, the Catholic revival after 1815. David Blackburn describes the arc of events since 1800. Internally declining, the butt of enlightened intellectuals and political radicals at the end of the 18th century, the Church in the last 200 years has demonstrated a remarkable capacity for survival and rejuvenation. From Pius IX to John Paul II, Rome has centralized its power, mobilized the faithful, and taken on its enemies. Liberalism and nationalism in the 19th century, socialism and communism in the 20th, indifference and materialism at all times. What is surprising is that the revival in the years around 1815 was not gradual, but sudden. Political conditions improved with the restoration of monarchies at the Congress of Vienna, monarchies which were favourably disposed towards religion, but not as keen to control it as the ones before the French Revolution. Intellectually, there was a widespread feeling that Enlightenment mistakes had led to the horrors of the Revolution and that a return to tradition was needed. More important, however, was a revival of organised piety in France and Ireland. It was soon exported widely, driving a missionary expansion that would make the Church a truly global enterprise. You'll recognise some of the names of persons and orders in what follows, because their followers were still around to teach you. In France, St. Martin Champagnat, ordained in 1816 and distressed by the ignorance of religion in rural areas, founded the Marist brothers. St. Jean Vianney, the curé of Ars, ordained in 1815 after enduring the years of persecution, became a symbol of the revival of piety in rural France. Missionary activity overseas became a sudden focus of enthusiasm with the foundation of the Marist Fathers in 1816 and of the Society for the Propagation of the Faith, begun in Lyon in 1822 to organise lay financial support for foreign missions. Frederick Ozanam founded the Society of St. Vincent de Paul in 1833. The ruined Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris was restored. The spire that you saw falling in the fire of 2019 dates from that time. Between 1800 and 1880, some 200,000 French women entered religious orders, mostly active orders. Jules Breton's painting of the 1850s, The Blessing of the Wheat in Artois, is an icon of the revival of rural piety in France. Catherine O'Driscoll summarises the foundation of active orders in Ireland. Edmund Rice formed his first community at Waterford in 1808, the Christian Brothers. In 1807 and 8, the Brigidine Sisters and Patrician Brothers were founded in Carlow. In 1812, Mary Aikenhead established the Sisters of Charity in Dublin. Frances Ball brought the Loreto Sisters to Dublin in 1821. In 1828, Catherine Macaulay began the Sisters of Mercy, also in Dublin. The number of nuns in Ireland rose dramatically, from 120 in 1800 to more than 8,000 in 1901. The typical 19th century nun was not contemplative. Instead, she taught in public schools, visited the sick and poor in their homes, worked in hospitals, and provided other forms of welfare service. In conclusion, around 1800, Catholics from Pius VII down to humble peasants sheltering fugitive priests had inherited strong faith and devised survival strategies that meant the Church was ready for better times after 1815. As Oded Heilbronner writes, against the background of the sustained attacks on the Catholic Church between 1789 and 1815, one can only wonder how European Catholicism emerged in post-1815 Europe as more populist, much more ultramontane, and generally better equipped to survive in a more rational, industrial, liberal, and secular Europe.